Human advancement can be measured in technological progress. Since the start of the digital economy, we've been creating the right conditions for innovation to thrive and deliver positive change. By creating policy, regulatory and legal frameworks that keep things stable, predictable, fair and scalable. And these pathways we create drive economic growth and build better societies. Behind the breakthroughs and ahead of the curve, Access Partnership is playing a critical role in a critical space at a critical time.
Welcome to this webinar entitled Can AI Solve Content Moderation and Regulatory Compliance for Platforms in 2023? This webinar is co-hosted with TrustLab and is also the launch event to announce the partnership between TrustLab and Access Partnership. And we are joined by a stellar panel. Without further ado, please let me introduce the moderator of this session, May-Ann. She's the director of the FairTech Institute at Access Partnership. May-Ann, over to you.
Thanks, Anya. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. My name is May-Ann, and I reside, it is in the evening for us, so it's a good evening, Anya, and to all of our speakers from Singapore. Our stellar panel is definitely also very international. We do have Stan, who I believe hails from Slovakia, Thomas, who is, Thomas, are you based in London at the moment?
I'm in London, yes, that's right.
Yes, London at the moment. We have Dr. Joanne, who calls in from Australia, and Tom, who is in the US, if I'm not wrong. Thank you very much to everybody. Today, as Anya has mentioned, we are going to be discussing pretty interesting discussion topic, which is, can AI solve content moderation and regulatory compliance for platforms in 2023? Now, there's a lot of qualifiers in that sentence. We would love to say yes or no, AI can solve some of these problems, but I think the answer is probably going to be no. But I think for 2023, can it be done in that time zone? I think can it be done in that time frame? Is an easier answer. I think the answer is going to be no. I don't think we can quite resolve it just yet. But we do have, as we mentioned, a whole bunch of people here who will be chatting with us about this discussion. I'll have them do a quick introduction to everybody, but a couple of ground rules for us, which is that, or if you're not if, since you're in the audience, and if you want to interact with us, there is the chat function. After 2.5 years of COVID-related use of web technologies, I don't think that anybody will have difficulty using the chat function. Please feel free to drop in your questions. If you want people to connect with you on LinkedIn, please just drop in your LinkedIn and say, connect with me, etc. Please feel free to introduce yourself to each other, because this is really a great opportunity for you to use the platform to network with each other as well, and we would love to enable that. All right, so without further ado, I will be moving on and starting our discussion. I think that for content moderation questions and content moderation issues, I think we're really seeing an acceleration of the trickiness that comes with the desire to address some of the problems that are coming up. I don't want to say problems, but I think that there are issues, challenges of veracity, challenges of verification, challenges of knowing your client, knowing your customer. Lots of questions around online harms. There are so many compliance reporting requirements now that it's a little bit mind-boggling. And I know that a lot of folk that are in our audience as well as on our panel are facing these issues. So we're going to be chatting with them a little bit and asking them to share a little bit about what their world looks like, what their perspective is. So let me ask them the first question, which is, please introduce yourself, your work. Please give us an idea of how you and your company are looking at content moderation and some of the challenges that you're facing right now. And importantly, are you looking at AI to resolve some of these challenges? We're going to go to Thomas first.
May-Ann, thank you very much. I'm definitely going to be aligning with you on the sort of the no side of that question. I think not only because we've only got another 6 months in 2023, and whilst I fully subscribe to the reality that AI is a very powerful tool, I don't think 6 months is a long enough period of time. Also because I think many of these challenges are enduring and will be ongoing for many years, if not decades to come, and they will continue to evolve, and we will need institutions and standards that evolve alongside them. But maybe that's getting a little bit ahead of the conversation itself. So my name is Thomas Hughes. Back to your original question, Mayanne. My name is Thomas Hughes. I'm the director of the Oversight Board. The Oversight Board, which was set up about 3 years ago now by Meta, has a very simple mission, and that is to improve how Meta treats people around the world by applying content standards in a manner that really protects freedom of expression and other human rights. And the board does this by providing an independent check on Meta's content moderation and issuing binding decisions on specific pieces of content and cases, and also issuing recommendations. The board itself has 22 members from around the world, quite a diverse set of opinions and backgrounds. I should clarify that I'm not a board member, so we have co-chairs who lead the board, members themselves, and then I'm the director of the administration. So that's the staff that support the board as they deliberate on cases and make recommendations. We describe ourselves as an independent self-regulatory structure. It's interesting. It's going to be interesting to see how that fits in with the emerging regulatory structures that we're now seeing coming up around the world. But the reason why we describe ourselves as such is because we have a trust. That trust was, again, set up by Meta, but the funds in the trust can only be used for the purpose of the board. And the trustees themselves, obviously, are independent. And the board members, I should note as well, are self-appointing as well moving forward. In terms of the scale of the board's work, we've received well over 2.5 million appeals from users, directly from users, over the last few years. From those, we have quite a severe triaging process. So we've selected and issued about 35 decisions. But I would really actually draw attention, rather than to the decisions themselves, many of which are very important on important cases, but I'd really draw attention in this conversation to the recommendations. And the board has issued about 190 recommendations, and they cover quite a broad range of things, from content policies, sort of textual changes, to the community standards, Meta's community standards, but maybe more relevant for this conversation, also looking at enforcement issues, so how the product actually functions and the algorithmic treatment of content, and also transparency as well. In relation to AI, well, in Meta's own words, their AI work covers 2 main areas. So that's recommendations in ranking infrastructure and generative foundation models. And again, according to Meta, as of today, 20% of content in users' Facebook and Instagram feeds is recommended by AI from people or groups or accounts that they don't necessarily follow. And Meta clearly see this, as I think all major tech companies do, as a significant growth area, and have already announced that they are going to introduce additional AI-backed features. So in short, the board already has within its scope AI recommended as well as potentially AI generated content. And we see this particularly in relation to the enforcement and transparency areas, but we see this becoming an ever increasingly large area of work that the board is going to be involved in. Now, AI can't solve compliance issues on its own, and the way humans build and then oversee these processes will, of course, become ever more important as this goes on. And this thing will include things like, internal human oversight and third-party fact-checking and independent expertise, and of course, a strong commitment from companies and others to transparency as well. And each time we make recommendations, of course, as in relating to the board's work, this goes into obviously impacting how Meta's AI systems work and how they, basically assess and undertake content moderation. Now, I should be clear as well that the board does not have either the expertise or the scope to look at specifically into current or specifically into pieces of code. So we don't do that kind of granular level of review. But obviously all the recommendations that we do make focus on improving how users experience those platforms, but also then speak to, as I said earlier, some of the way in which AI is currently being deployed. And with that, Mayanne, let me stop there and pass back to you.
Thank you, Thomas. I love the quick introduction to the Oversight Board. And one of the things which I really like about what the Oversight Board is doing is that I feel it is the forerunner for the approaches that we're taking with content moderation. I mean, this idea of self-regulation is something which people like to talk about. They like to try and do it, perhaps with industry associations and with self-organizing groups. But there are always these other motivations which are sometimes pulling at the seams, and a lot of times coalitions just fall apart. And I see Dr. Jo nodding as well, so she probably has some experience with some stories to tell us, I can imagine. So thank you for that, Thomas. Again, it's a forerunner. Don't think that it's solved all of the challenges just yet. And again, with the question of AI, I can see that you've put it as a AI generated content, but also AI solutions. You're playing around with it. I don't think there are any answers just yet, but you're definitely right at the cutting edge. With that, I'm going to turn to Stanislav, because I know that Stanislav sits on the other side of the regulatory spectrum, which is that we are government. We are gonna regulate you, and let's put down some regulations. So Stanislav, why don't you tell us a little bit about what your role is, what you do, and how you've been approaching the idea of content moderation with AI.
Thank you very much, Mayan, and thank you very much to both Access Partnership and Choslav for invitation. Glad to be here with this stellar panel. When it comes to us as regulators looking at the AI, there are multiple approaches that we take to this. And if you're asking whether AI can solve the content moderation question in the framework of this year, let me just put our perspective that we're still dealing with user-generated content, that there's a large amount of being shared on the platforms, and the recommender systems, algorithmic recommender systems, that present some challenges still. And we're grappling with these technologies already at the European level with the set of regulations that are put in place. And I will talk about some of them later on. When it comes to the challenges of the content moderation itself, we see it also from the perspective. So let me maybe come back a little bit. For the last 30 years, the Council for Media Services, which I work for, has been focusing on the broadcasting and retransmission and regulating the broadcasting within the European framework. And since the audiences have moved and the media consumption have moved from the broadcasting further to the digital platforms, we are now updating our own competencies and our capacities to align ourselves with the new realities. And now, as a Council for Media Services here in Slovakia, but many other regulators from the audiovisual media sector in European Union, we have moved regulation from the looking at the specific pieces of content, rather looking now at the systemic oversight and looking at risk that some of the systems are presenting to the societies that we're here to protect as regulators. So with that, I would just say that we have new competences looking at, of course, the video sharing platforms that are stemming from the Audiovisual Media Services Directive. And now with the incoming flagship legislation called the Digital Services Act, that probably most of you around the world also know that this is a first of its kind legislation that is put in place and introduces new kind of approaches for regulators to look at content moderation and not just content regulation. We're preparing ourselves as regulators to build our own capacities and already thinking how AI can actually help us in our daily work in detection of these major risks that some of these systems are posing potentially, and at the same time trying to build our own expertise and competencies when it comes to first understanding how AI is being used by the different actors that we regulate in order to regulate them, of course. So this is a process, to be honest, and most of the European regulators are rather smaller authorities at the moment. It is not clear that audiovisual media services regulators will be those, doing oversight over digital platforms in all across EU member states. This is still being discussed on the political level. But from our point of view, we have experiences over decades looking into the content, about objectivity of the news broadcasting and so on. So there is a role for us as media regulators to play in this big game of regulating the digital world. So we have seen some challenges of the content moderation, specifically thanks to our role within ERGA, which is an advisory body to European Commission. It's called European Group of Regulators for Audiovisual Media Services. And I personally lead a work stream within this group that is dedicated to disinformation. And here I open a topic of disinformation that is, very large and complex, and different parts of the world have different approaches to things. And of course, there's a very controversial discussion about possible censorship when you talk about misinformation and disinformation. And when you look at the terms of service of the platforms and you try to use the self-regulation that we now have in place with the code of practice on disinformation in the EU, you see some challenges when it comes to understanding the platform's enforcements of their own policies in different member states. We see some different approaches, it seems to us. So these are the kind of challenges we see currently with the content moderation. We also have new competencies as a regulatory authority in Slovakia looking at specific pieces of or specific categories of illegal content, including terrorism content, child pornography, or child sexual abuse materials, and other categories of hate speech, for example. And unfortunately, in Slovakia, we had a first-hand experience last year after October, a shooting in Bratislava, the capital of Slovakia, when we, as a regulator, for the first time after having these new competencies, had a chance to look at the role of the platforms in radicalization of the attacker, and that the follow-up, what was happening after the attack and the hate speech that spread across all kinds of platforms when it comes to the group that was targeted by the attack, and that was an LGBTQ community, and the two people were killed in the attack, and the follow-up, how we've seen that the content that is flagrantly illegal, according to the Slovak Penal Code, has stayed up for some time, even though it has been flagged by the users. And as soon as the regulator got involved, we kind of resolved the issue later on. Of course, it was taken down. But from our perspective, this is not about the regulator's role to watch over all of the internet. The user flagging systems of all the platforms should be working effectively. I'm hearing somebody else. Moment. I don't know if you can hear it as well. No, there's a way. Thank you very much. So I just want to finish with saying that there's a situation currently that we're in where we're using the rules, using liability for the third-party content as a policy lever to achieve some goals. And this is an ex-post approach to things, while the new Digital Services Act is bringing the due diligence obligations on behalf of very large online platforms as they are defined. And this is ex-ante regulation, which is something that will give us more systemic oversight and some powers looking at how the digital platforms at global scale are enforcing their own policies and following the EU standards when it comes to all kinds of regulations that we have when it comes to privacy, to protection of minors, and general interest in media pluralism. So I would finish there, hopefully addressed the question at hand, and thank you very much, Megan.
Thank you, Stanislav. I think that you put on in front of us, it's a can of worms that you put in front of us, because there are so many things that we can unpack from you. And one of them is actually very much in line with something which one of our participants actually noticed, which is about resources. Ankur Gupta actually wrote that he feels that trust and safety jobs may have evaporated because right now there are lots of job cuts all over the world. So maybe right now it waters down the ability to keep up with content moderation. And I think that, Stanislav, you mentioned this as well, because there is the need to make sure that your your team also upskills and make sure that they know how to deal with these current issues in the digital space. So your platforms have moved, your media consumption has moved from audiovisual to the old school audiovisual to online. So that's one change already that has happened. But in your example, the problem has also become more complex because of the question about, for example, radicalization and how do you trace all of that. And also, I think, and maybe this is again where Tom and Thomas could come in a little bit later and discuss the relationship between the regulator and the regulated entities as platforms also sort of has evolved and become a little bit more complex, because it's no longer just, we're going to hit you with the regulations, comply or die. It's not like that anymore. It's really how do we come to a new equilibrium? How do we come to a new coexistence? And I'm not quite sure whether the academic community can actually give us some perspectives around that. I'm going to turn to Dr. Jo to see what she has to say. So Dr. Jo, please tell us a little bit about your research, because I do know that you come to it from a slightly different angle, really interesting angle, which I think Ankur Gupta might also be interested in, given that he's talking about the actual people who do content moderation. Dr. Jo.
And of course, the academic community can provide insight into this. I'm a professor in a university here in Sydney, Australia, and my research focuses on the relationship that we have with devices and with the online space. my research focuses on kind of going to the coalface and speaking and interviewing a lot of people in their homes, on the bus, you know, everywhere and anywhere, and really understanding content moderation and online safety and online well-being from the user's perspective. So one of the good things, I suppose, in terms of being an academic is that I'm not necessarily tied to the government or a corporate entity. I act much more independently, so I'm able to kind of get a different angle on the experiences that we're having regarding this issue. In terms of can AI kind of assist us in online moderation? To a certain extent, but it's certainly not the answer, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. One of the things that I do as part of my research, because I have quite an in-depth understanding of users, but particularly around young users, so children, teenagers and young adults, they're kind of an area that I really focus on. So I've got quite an in-depth understanding of that user group, who make up around 50% of internet users worldwide. So it's a major user group, but they also use the online space in quite different ways to, say, a 40 or 50-year-old does. So I think in terms of thinking about content moderation, there's also a need to kind of segment these users, because different needs are needed for each different group. One of the things that I'm finding in terms of my research and my work, and I also work quite closely with the big tech corporations, including Apple and Google, who I advise to and share my latest research with as well. And one of the things that I'm finding with content moderation is the aim of it is that, you know, there's this balance between the freedom of sharing ideas, which is what the online space is mostly about, particularly for young people, and then making sure these online platforms are safe but positive and empowering. So getting this right is proving to be one of the most difficult situations, you know, we're trying to grapple with right now. So if we focus on the younger user, so children, teenagers and young adults, there are particular invisible risks for this age group that aren't being acknowledged in the general term of, you know, online moderation. And there are particular aspects that seem to be slipping under the radar of content moderation that have the potential for harm for this age group. And this age group have a particular kind of propensity for harm. Not only are they engaging with one piece of content that may have a risky theme or something, but because of the intensity that they're using technology, and because they're young and growing up in a world saturated with this kind of risky content, this cumulative effect it has on them is quite different to the effect it can have on us as adults. And that's what I really want to focus on. And I'll just give you an example. Since I'm focusing on youth, I'm going to focus on social media in this example, but particularly TikTok. And it's not just TikTok, but I'm just using them as an example today. So like all social media platforms, they don't permit violence or sexual content. And we all know regulating that kind of content is really important, not just for children, but for us as well. But let's look to what is still an issue for this age group that is kind of starting to slowly gain ground and working its way around the edges of policy. And why it's working its way around the edges of policy is that it offers a very kind of lucrative business opportunity that businesses can leverage. So, for example, TikTok has a ban on all gamification and gambling actions, okay, which which we probably all understand. But, you know, within the last 12 months, they have very quietly expanded quite a controversial kind of trial of partnering with gambling agencies. So it started around the US Super Bowl last year. You know, Rihanna was the halftime performance, and the agency that they partnered with was Sportsbet. So it was very hidden, but it was happening. If you're a TikTok user, you would have noticed perhaps a slight change in the content. And what they were doing is this betting agency wanted to expand their kind of client base to not just young men, but women as well, young women. So the content started to focus on Rihanna, you know, a pop singer, and what she was wearing in her halftime performance. And they were showing that, you know, as Sportsbet, They were, having bets on what she would wear, what props she would use, how long she would sing for. So not the hard-on kind of sports content, but different kind of content, but still, shaping young people's understanding of betting and gambling and trying to make it more kind of acceptable. So this kind of content wasn't necessarily easily detected as sponsored content, although they use the hashtag, gambling responsibly, something like that. So that obviously was quite successful. Now we're seeing similar ads here in Australia, not necessarily about Rihanna, but about other things that are also kind of softer entries into betting. So when I've interviewed young people about it, and they're the ones who actually brought it to my attention in a way, they don't realise it's sponsored content. They don't realise it's advertising and trying to shape them. They see it as different kind of content, just videos that are uploaded. So when we talk about, and now TikTok, have partnered with a couple more betting agencies. So there's this slippery slope of content moderation. We have this policy, but this policy, it seems to be grey in a lot of areas. We know that violence and sexual content is harmful for children, but what about these other aspects that aren't necessarily black and white? Betting, alcohol, where do we start to see these kind of stretching of policy? So my research examines this kind of area. So while I've used TikTok as an example, I think all social media, the big guys as well as the smaller guys who are popping up as well, if we think of content moderation and being able to regulate any particularly harmful or risky content, then where do we draw the line? So AI, can it assist? Of course it can assist in, identifying kind of risky themes, but it's still the policy that's decided by the humans that is kind of, putting the prompts or putting the boundaries around AI. So I think at this point, AI can be helpful, but I don't think it will necessarily solve any problems.
Too bad for AI, good for human beings, definitely in our jobs.
Yeah.
I definitely agree with the elasticity of both the content that is expanding, the elasticity of what we consider marketing. And I think Tom actually, who is just incidentally the next speaker that I'm going to turn the time to, is actually at the forefront of actually observing some of these cultural changes that are happening. So thank you for that perspective, Dr. Joy. I definitely think academia has a bit more of a sort of overall view of what's happening. But let's turn to Tom and let's match that out. So Tom, agree, disagree? Tell us about what you do and Trust Lab, as well as your approach towards content moderation and view towards where AI could possibly or not give us an opportunity to address these elasticities.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think I'm gonna put my stake in the other end of the field here and say AI and ML is already here. We're right in the middle of it, and it certainly won't solve everything, but we're having to deal already with the effects, and it's a very quickly accelerating pace, whether it's the creation of the content, the distribution, but also increasingly, us actually trying to use AI to defend or to mitigate some of the harmful effects on all sides. You can think of it almost like an arms race that we're in the middle of. Really quickly about me, I'm the founder and CEO of a company called Trust Lab. Our mission is to make the internet a safer place for humanity. We build software as a service for online safety. We're working with technology platforms, regulators, academic partners, think tanks to help improve health and safety on online platforms. And I'm going to talk in a little bit more about how that is, how we do that. My co-founders and I spent over a decade each working for large social media companies, leading the trust and safety teams. In my case, I founded and then grew Google's trust and safety team over 12 years across all the product areas across the world. And we started initially with scams and spams and pornographic content, and then it became misinformation and hate speech and terrorism recruitment online and all the much more difficult problems that we're all facing. I left because I felt platforms were not set up to solve that problem by themselves, and we can talk more about later why that is. But I truly believe that partnerships like my distinguished panelists here are actually the way to go to solve that. I don't think the platforms do it well. I don't think regulators can do it by themselves. Certainly technology, small technology service provider like my own company can't do it by themselves either. This is a very special time because 4 big factors are coming together in our field of content moderation, and AI is going to be a catalyst on this. The 4 are: 1, it is sort of a top of mind topic for many leaders, whether they are in private companies, whether they are in government, whether in media or in social positions of leadership. When you think about the internet, when you think about the large social media companies, for example, very often the conversation is about harm or the negative impacts that they're having. So that is the first one. The second one is we see this acceleration of content generation. Generative AI, one aspect, obviously the increasingly automated ways of producing content, but so much more interaction and transaction communication that we have as a society is moving online, particularly newer and more vulnerable groups. And we're seeing that just tremendous acceleration of content generation presenting a new challenge. The third one is regulation, and we can maybe even talk more about this in this panel. In many parts of the world, we're seeing governments stepping in because platforms clearly have not done enough over the past decade or so. And the last one, we see that platforms having a lot of cost pressure nowadays, and they're really trying to automate increasingly. A few minutes ago, one of my panelists mentioned that staffing has been reduced in some of these areas, and obviously cost pressure is playing a really big role in this. And so we see these 4 factors coming together, and really that is kind of almost as a function of these 4 factors leading to an increase in AI and ML. Really quickly about my company, we take the approach that we're using primarily technology, artificial intelligence and machine learning to find and mitigate the impact of harmful content online. We ingest large amounts of information from the open web. We combine this across actors, across content, and then we are building content classifiers to score that content or those actors for their likelihood to be harmful. And then we're working with platforms and governments and others. The 4 services that we provide that I also feel are fundamental in kind of solving that issue for society and for the industry are: number 1, analytics. I think we need better data, we need better measurement of what's actually going on online. There's this old saying, you can't manage what you don't measure, and I think that's very true here. I think we often talk about things that we really have no idea, how good or bad they are. So that is one. The second one is moderation. We're building systems, and I do think we're past the point where humans can solve it. Humans will always be needed to guide it, to build ground truth data, to check how the systems work, but it's going to be machines and who do the moderation heavy lifting, and so we're involved in that. The third one is as regulatory compliance. We are in this, and I'm very supportive of emerging regulation. Not all the regulation is great. Having governments regulate speech, having governments regulate information or misinformation, I think we all have to be very, very careful how it's done. But overall, I think it's a good thing. And now we face the challenge that companies actually need to be able to comply with it. And that's actually much harder, right? The regulation was hard, but the compliance is harder to work on this. And the fourth thing we do is consulting. We do work with lots of stakeholders to help them understand the challenges and opportunities in this space. So back to you. Thanks for the time.
Thank you, Tom. And definitely, we do have a lot of ways in which we are definitely having to unpack where the newer and more vulnerable groups are are being bombarded with this acceleration of a lot more content that's coming down the pipeline. And I do know, I have some friends who are psychologists, and they're actually saying that there is actually, it's unprecedented. There are no tests. There is no body of literature that can help us understand the impact of this new media landscape that Stanislav so accurately put it. There is nothing that will help us understand what the next generation is gonna experience and understand this risk-based, or not risk-based, but risky audiences that are facing a lot of different types of risky accumulative content. So definitely, welcome to everybody. If you've just joined us, but if you've joined us and you didn't catch the beginning, we're talking about AI solving content moderation and regulatory compliance for platforms in 2023. I think that all of the panelists have pretty much agreed. 2023, 6 months left. We're not going to make it. We're at the tail end already of May. So I don't think we're going to make it for 2023, but definitely what are the challenges and what the problems that how can we map them out? And if you, as part of the audience, if you've got a question for anyone, please just drop them in. As you can tell, the meeting chat is pretty busy. Feel free to drop in your LinkedIn if you want people to connect with you, or if you want to have a comment, please just drop them in. If you've got a question, just drop them in. We're taking comments and questions throughout the whole entire seminar. I'm going to move on to a next section where I would like to help us break down some of the perspectives that we can approach AI content moderation, because there are so many different ways in which you can unpack even just a single one of these terms: AI content moderation, regulatory compliance for platforms, for example. So could you tell us a little bit about what exactly are the challenges of actual platform regulation from your industries and from your perspective? So if I were, for example, a beginner and I were writing the Wikipedia article, for example, how would I start to title each of the sections? How would I go about thinking and asking the question, would AI be able to assist, or has AI been assisting with resolving some of these issues? How would I break them down? Dr. Joanne, could you perhaps share with us how maybe academia would start to break it down?
Yeah, it's such a tough, big kind of wild beast, isn't it, to reel in this one. One of the things that I do as part of my work is I'm interviewed in the media a lot. So I'm on like breakfast TV and the news a real lot, giving advice to people around kind of the latest tensions that we have around technology. And of course, one of the most recent kind of questions I get from journalists a lot is around AI and protecting us, how much damage is it going to cause, all that kind of thing, but also about content regulation. And one of the difficulties I always find with content regulation is the very global nature of content. So who is regulating, and where does the responsibility lie? And I think that's at the absolute heart of one of the issues. And I think the other heart of the issue is that the content belongs in, with commercial organisations. So in some ways, we kind of expect the social media platforms or the big platforms to look after us, but like a government may look after us in a way. But there's this shift now in that a lot of our safety really does belong in these commercial corporations. So while we expect them to look after us, their main aim is still to make a profit. So I think that's one of the big issues. I think also that we are starting from a midpoint. So we've been online and engaging with online content for a number of years now. So if we were to start from the beginning, we would say that you would incorporate something like a safety by design approach. But we're already halfway through and it's already massive, so we can't go back. So at what point can we start to bring in that kind of idea? So right now it feels like content moderation is a bit of a, I know it's not, but it kind of feels like it's an afterthought. Content is up. Oh no, that's no good. We better do something about it. That sounds like an afterthought to me. So there needs to be a different kind of approach to this. And one of the other speakers said, we don't have enough data on this. And, I completely agree. We don't have the breadth of data. We don't have the history of data. We've got very little data around AI and our experiences with that and its ability to, address this kind of harmful content. So I think that's also a really big issue. And how do we actually approach it from that research point of view? What kind of new research do we need? And where is that going to be funded? Because obviously that's always a big issue. But if we are actually committed to this, there needs to be funding for it as well.
Thanks, Dr. Joe. I feel that there definitely are lots of different types of motivations, and you're right. We're in midstream, really. It's like trying to, what is it? It's like trying to build the aircraft while it's flying, trying to change the aircraft while it's flying. It's a little bit difficult to do that right now. I think that what you mentioned about the motivations of who pays, etc., probably will resonate with two of our people in the audience, Kim and David. Kim had asked the question, had made a comment earlier about the motivations of gambling being sort of parked into the academic ecosystem by sponsorships, right? And David had made a question that there are only so many content moderators around the world. Does this mean that we're probably just going to be on the compliance? Let's just make it a tick box exercise, which I'm pretty sure all of us are going to say it's probably not going to be a tick box exercise, but you can't discount the fact that motivation and is going to be playing a part in some of this. Tom, do you have some thoughts around this? Is it going to be a tick box exercise as David has highlighted?
Yeah,
David, I hope I haven't mangled your question. I see 4 thumbs up for your question, so I wanted to address it.
Yeah, I want to actually go back and address it by picking up to where the previous speaker left off, and that is, are we doing enough to funding efforts to actually understand what is currently going on? Measurement is, I think, a foundation of really understanding where we currently have the gaps, but also if regulatory frameworks that are emerging are effective. I give you one really interesting example. The European Commission launched a project about 6 months ago to measure the amplification of violent extremism speech on social media across the 6 largest social media platforms across 8 different markets. Basically, the idea was to see if a user engages with violent extremism content, are these AI and ML algorithms feeding them more content, basically amplifying that. And they looked across Facebook and Instagram and TikTok and YouTube and I think LinkedIn and Twitter, and we collaborate with the European Commission on that. You can actually measure that, and you are finding that application is happening, but it's not just difficult work, it's also expensive, right? Because you have to, it's very manual. And we can go into reasons why that is, despite all of the AI and ML. But there's a lot of evidence there already, and it is, it points to trends and it points to gaps, and there are a lot of hooks that we have by measurement. The second one is we can. I'm taking the view that having a single regulatory or rule-based system for everyone on the web is probably not the right way to go. I think that different communities who have sort of different needs and different expectations, and obviously a very important one are children, right, where you probably have very different ones, and people who are choosing to engage in certain, higher risk, kind of engaging with higher risk content, for instance. But if we have content and speech that is illegal, I do think there need to be frameworks in place that allow us to enforce, but then also to monitor. And gambling is certainly one that we're seeing very kind of very different development in the United States. For instance, we see lots more states, individual states, actually opening up gambling. We see other parts of the world where it's much more locked down. And so if you are with a platform right now, it's very difficult, right? Because these are global platforms, users are interacting from all over, and then you have some countries say you can do and others say you can, and so it makes enforcement almost impossible, and so it does become a checkbox exercise. And so we need, I think, more, like, we have to think about enforceability when we create these frameworks as well. So
thanks for that. It does sound like it continues to be. I like the fact that you're focused very much on measurement. I think that this is something which which Dr. Joanne probably also agrees, because she mentioned not enough data. We need the data to make the proper decisions. And, you know, we always want our decisions and policies to be made from a data-driven perspective. We were just not quite. I like the fact that you pointed out that actually the measurements exist. They're really expensive though. And I do know that some people in our audience are also from the tech sector and are also dealing with this. So that I would love it if people could comment if you're in the audience and actually engaging with some of these AI approaches towards measuring, and is it really that expensive? I'm guessing yes, because of the customizations that need to be in place. But probably Stanislav also has an opinion towards this, because something which Tom mentioned is one policy to rule them all, the one policy ring that will put us in place. And he says, no, that's probably not the solution. And and Tom, you also mentioned something earlier when you said, I think it's necessary that we all start to work together in a more collaborative fashion across the different zones. It's not just policy, it's not just the platforms, it's not just academia, but it's everyone working together. I'm not sure, Stanislav, if that's something which you see moving forward, or would you say no? I think that it still has to fall somewhere in between government and something else.
Thank you very much. This is a very interesting discussion, because we as regulators, within the framework of negotiation of the new legislation that I mentioned, the Digital Services Act, there's first of all an ambition of the European Union to be a role model for other possible regulations coming up. I think this flagship legislation might bring some visibility into what can be actually enforceable, as Tom said. We have been pushing as regulators very much for the access to data. There is now a very strong push within the legislation itself to give these digital services coordinators the power to vet the researchers, and those researchers should then be given the data by the platforms. The actual enforcement of these rules and the actual access to data will have to be tested. That's going to happen next year, I assume, the soonest. And then what becomes an issue potentially, and Tom alluded to it already, this is a expensive exercise. This is academic institutions all across the board are not in the financial situation that everybody's perfectly happy. I'm coming from Slovakia, which is a small market in general on every kind of industry that you can imagine. So academia is deeply underfunded, in my opinion. So, for example, even if we have big societal issues linked to some of the risks that are posed by the hate speech that is happening online and that is having an impact on the politics, internal politics here in Slovakia, we need to address this, and we're hoping to use the tools that are given to us by this European legislation where we can pool the resources of other regulators, possibly going into partnerships with the private companies that are here to help also regulators to kind of understand and see how we can access this data, and then how can we process it. We are the ones then able to kind of use this on the policy angle to see whether we can influence the legislatives to kind of change a little bit or reshuffle how the regulation looks if it's still under negotiations. So there are many things to unpack there, but we have some practical experiences already as this new digital regulator, that we have some of these competencies already at hand, and we already see some. And this is again, I confess that this is anecdotal evidence, but very many times it happens to us that some classifiers also struggle with the contextual decisions when it comes to slippery concepts. When we talk about hate speech, there's a lot of cultural and other context that you have to have. So Tom has said I'm sorry, Tom, I'm just coming back to your points, that there will be machines, doing the heavy lifting. We see this, and this is only an assumption on behalf of the regulators at the point, because we don't have the sufficient transparency into the inner workings of the platforms, that there is apparently some machine learning models doing the content moderation, because we ourselves are able to escalate very specific cases, and then the responses that we get don't seem like there was an actual human review done by some of the platforms. So we see, and this is specifically true for the slippery concepts, as I mentioned, hate speech. Then we have an open question that is still not resolved, and we're grappling with it now, and it's kind of a political problem as well. Should we as regulators prefer speed to limit the harm? So, for example, the takedown requests are speedily processed and the content is down. People from the security environment would tell you that If it's not taken down within 24 hours, then it's kind of already the harm is already done. There's not much to do afterwards. And if the platforms are saying they take action days and weeks after that, the harm is already there. Or should we strive to detach from the move fast, break things mindset and engage in this multi-stakeholder codes of conduct? As you say, and I think Joe alluded to it, and Marianne, you mentioned it as well. This is global scale companies and local regulators. And the European Union might be big. There are larger markets. The whole world is kind of facing the same problems now. And we think the multi-stakeholder approach is always the better part. So now when I mentioned the disinformation, I think this is a good example of how this is being dealt with on the European market. When there are different actors included in negotiations, there are research organizations, fact checkers, regulators, policymakers, and the platforms themselves with their trust and safety teams and others talking to each other, trying to understand each other, how these approaches could build some kind of self-regulation that could actually help the situation. Because I would agree with the approach that regulating speech is a difficult job. We know it very well, but regulating misinformation and disinformation is even more complex. This is something that nobody has a silver bullet for this. So there's always a call for a multi-stakeholder approach to these kind of things. So I think AI should or could help platforms to alleviate the pressure in some areas, and specifically when we talk about manifestly illegal content. So if I see Nazi symbols, denial of Holocaust that is illegal in all across Europe, this is something that AI or machine learning models can actually help identify, detect, and then take down. But there are many gray areas where we might have an issue with machine learning taking decisions and us as regulators. We're still human, so we have to do it afterwards to kind of verify whether those systems in place are doing what they're supposed to do and whether the decisions that are taken are actually limiting the harms that we're trying to limit. So that would be my take.
May I make one small comment as a follow-on?
Sure.
I may have some good news here, Stanislav, as well. Like we've seen, particularly with the emergence this year of completely new higher performing AI and ML models, so ChatGPT and others, that we're seeing almost a factor 10 increase in some of the performance of these models to be able to detect previously almost impossible types of misinformation, hate speech, and others. And so and we're looking at these models, every day. We're actually very, very confident and very, very excited about the potential they have. There are drawbacks though, and some of them are the explainability, right, of these models and why they score. There's ethical AI issues, there's the absence of policy. So we still have many other issues, but the classifier and the AI and ML model almost leapfrogging now all these other aspects. And it will be much less expensive to generate ground truths, to generate new models, but all the supporting infrastructure around it needs to catch up. And that's probably one of my bigger concerns now. It's less the technology that is lagging, it's really everything else.
Thanks, Tom, for that, and thanks, Stanislav. I think that the last 5 minutes belong to Thomas, but before I turn the time to Thomas, I want to address some of the questions which are coming in, because I think that they sort of cancel each other out. The first question is from Iman, who says, what role could you see AI educating users in improving user accountability and behavior? I don't know about you, but I have difficulty controlling what my mom posts up on our family chats. I'm not quite sure we can control anybody posting anything online. We also have pretty interesting questions from Nikki, who asks about, hey, can AI help improve the labor practices for the human people who are actually doing the content moderation? But Ankur asks the complete opposite question and says, do we want such AI, such perfect, for example, AI running unimpeded and important policing roles? So it's like, okay, this is, maybe you guys should connect offline and just chat with each other, because I think that what Stanislav mentioned correctly is that we're still human. We still need humans to check on the stuff that is going through. And if the system, for example, says, okay, explainability, like some human kind of needs to read through the explainability and make sure that it's actually valid, and nobody's done it, okay, then what exactly have we done? So have we just shot ourselves in the foot? But Thomas, I think that you probably have a really, really unique position on some of the things which have been raised. So over to you.
Marianne, thank you. I have the feeling we're just starting the conversation now, and we only have 4 minutes left. I think we need another hour. So if we could organize another one, that would be great. I think Anka's question there is a great one. It would be my counter question to Tom around looking. I mean, I'm also optimistic about what AI may bring in terms of content moderation and content governance. But my opening question would be, how do you generate ground truth in the absence of the ground truth, in the absence of policy? How do you ensure that AI moderation is actually correctly identifying whether it be hate speech or other types of issues? But again, that's a whole new conversation. I think in the couple of minutes I have left, I would say, man, you actually described emerging regulation as not a comply or die scenario earlier on in the conversation, and I actually think it kind of is. And I think regulators, and we've been talking a lot about the EU, regulators are very minded now to use these new tools and to use them very aggressively against tech companies, particularly US tech, but tech companies, writ large. And I think if tech companies don't step up and start to essentially fulfill the expectations of the regulators, what comes next will either be more draconian regulation and/or extremely large fines that jeopardize both the continuation of those tech companies operating within the EU or other jurisdictions, or maybe even their operations sort of globally at the same time. So I think there's been a few comments around the need for partnerships, what I would think of as co-regulation. I'm definitely a big subscriber to that. We're going into a very complex era of co-regulation. But I think if you look at what's happened, in decades past around co-regulatory structures that have been established for media, you can definitely see that you can have freedom of expression, compliance, make sure that those standards are not necessarily overseen directly by government, but have sort of intermediary bodies. And those systems work, and they've worked for many, many decades. So we ought to think about how to borrow from those. I guess my two notes of caution, and again, these are kind of posed as opening a new conversation rather than closing this one. But one is, of course, the EU is kind of, yes, it's leading the charge, but we have the tail end of the AVMS directive. We have the DMA, we have the DSA, we have the MFA, we have the AI Act coming up. It is wildly complex, to say the least, trying to understand all the different bodies that are going to be created and so on and so forth. And also considering it's a multi-stakeholder approach as well, the conversations are numerous and complex, to say the least. And my concern is that the timeframes for implementation are extremely short, but the reality is time is required. And I don't know how to balance those two things out necessarily. But more conversation, more dialogue, and also willingness to trust, I think, is crucial. The other thing I would flag is potential unforeseen outcomes. So companies will pivot to ensure the compliance, right? They will put everything that a large jurisdiction is putting at the top of their list in terms of compliance at the top of their list. We've got to think about potential unforeseen outcomes in that regard, because what we may be doing is shifting responsibility across to others to start defining what those areas are. And other things that maybe are higher up the list that tech companies were prioritizing may drop lower down the list, right? Tech companies are not moral vacuums, right? They do try and apply standards. Yes, they're businesses. Yes, they prioritize certain things over others. Yes, there definitely can be improvement, but at the same time, they have, many, in my appreciation of it, have been trying to apply various standards. So we've got to think about what are the unintended consequences of this, right? In terms of speed, in terms of prioritization, and so on, and this multi-stakeholder environment. And those, and man, I'm just going to say very briefly, they may sound two slightly skeptical questions to pose at the end, but I want to end by stressing that I'm definitely a fan of co-regulation, and I'm definitely a fan of getting a lot of regulation out and then working together to try and figure out what it actually means in practice and to make it function in reality.
Thanks, Thomas, and really thank you for being succinct over there. I'm going to try and wrap it up with apologies to those of you who are communicating by chat and etc. I think that we will be, feel free to join us on our mailing list, etc., so we can continue the discussion. As I agree with Thomas, we're at the beginning of our conversation. I think we could go for another hour at least. It looks like, question, can AI solve content moderation regulatory compliance for platforms in 2023? Answer is going to be no. And it looks like we're having to deal with a whole bunch of pieces that we'll need to lay out for a risk management sort of approach, because we're seeing a couple of things. And I'm going to repeat some of the things which are keywords that I wrote down. insufficient data. We simply don't have enough information on what we're talking about at this point in time. I think that we need to talk about, as what Tom mentioned, the unforeseen outcomes. I think that co-regulation and that need for the multi-stakeholder approach, combined with another term that I heard, which is complexity and complex situations and getting even more so. I think that's something which is something that is facing all of us with the need to put in AI to solve content moderation issues, both of which have their own sort of question marks, because we do need that willingness to trust, as Thomas mentioned. The enforceability and compliance false dichotomy, I would say, is something which is a bit of a challenge. I think Stanislav probably has a lot of things to say about that. Like, we can put out the regulations, but if we can't check on it, it's going to be useless. So that short time frame, the accelerated time frame that we're dealing with, is definitely going to be a bit of a challenge. So I'm going to wrap up here because I know that we are 2 minutes over the hour already. I want to thank all of our participants and all of our speakers for being here. It is definitely not the end of this conversation. This is a pretty hairy issue. So please be in touch with each other. Please be in touch with us. Thank you very much for the time, and we hope to see you again at our next seminars. Thank you very much, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, good night.